third of all, winning the hearts and minds of the post-colonial world was important. It was going to be good for trade, good for assets, good for resources. Doesn't always work out as nicely as in practice is what Eisenhower thought in theory. For instance, in 1953 in Iran, the CIA helps engineer a coup to overthrow the democratically elected government to place the Shah of Iran, the king, if you will, back on his throne because he was going to have policies more favorable to the United States. In 1954 in Guatemala, the Central Intelligence Agency also engages in the same activities, toppling a legitimately elected government to place one that is more sympathetic to American priorities. And there are instances, for instance, where it did work out in a very post-colonial model. The Suez Crisis of 1956, the Egyptian government had nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been owned by the British and French, and said they were going to maintain it as a national property now. The British and French deploy their military forces along with the Israelis and take the canal area back over. Eisenhower is livid and cuts off foreign aid and petroleum supplies to the Western powers and demands they get out. Ultimately, they withdraw, freezes their assets, freezes their petroleum supplies from the United States. They withdraw. Many historians have charted the end of the British Empire to be right at that date, at that moment, because neither of those two nations would again really be this major power who could dictate global terms on the level that Soviets and the Americans could. So, and this leads to the Eisenhower Doctrine, which is different than the Truman Doctrine, but it's more specific, I guess, for just the Middle East. Eisenhower Doctrine is going to say that nations in the Middle East that need assistance to resist communist aggression can count on a friend in the United States in the terms of foreign aid, military training, and any of our assistance we can give if you're threatened by communism in any way. In 1954 in Vietnam, to back up by 2 years, we had historically had a foreign policy of allying ourselves with the European powers because what was going on in Europe was central to keeping the Iron Curtain from expanding, even though we didn't want to see colonial powers. So propping up the French government through maybe getting their colonies back on their feet so they could generate economic, power and dynamism from that suddenly became our goal. And as such, we supported the French with foreign aid in their struggle against the communists and independence-minded peoples of Vietnam. The French ultimately lose in 1954 when their key bases gets taken over at a place called Dien Bien Phu. They're forced to surrender. It breaks French resistance in many ways. It breaks the French will to be able to continue this struggle. And so at the Geneva Accords, it's promised that there are going to be free elections in Vietnam. The United States never allows these free elections to be held in the South, never has them, because we're afraid the winner probably would have been a fellow by the name of Ho Chi Minh, who will be very important for our Vietnam lectures later on, who was a communist, who represented the North, and who was sort of the Vietnamese George Washington, if you will. And as such, his victory would have ensured Vietnam having communist sympathies. So we try to follow the Korean model and keep it divided. Eisenhower is going to send in advisors and some aid to South Vietnam. He's not going to get American troops fully deployed, but there's a historical debate over whether or not Eisenhower or Kennedy is more responsible. Kennedy, as you're going to see, is going to get more people in, but Eisenhower definitely had resources flowing into South Vietnam during this late 50s period as part of trying to prevent what was known as the domino theory. And this should be stuff you remember from your history class. You should have done these things only a couple months ago, at best. And that's a theory that if one nation falls to communism in a region, it'll kind of knock the other dominoes over, or like a cancer, infect all the other nations and make an entire region communist. So it was vital for the United States to prop up or keep these dominoes up and keep nations from going over into the communist camp. In terms of great power politics in the era, Nikita Khrushchev is going to be the leader who is going to replace Stalin after his death. There's going to be one leader for a couple of years in between, and then Khrushchev will be the major player we'll see in this era dealing with Eisenhower, is going to come up with a principle, what he calls peaceful coexistence. He's going to argue that it won't be the goal of communists to take over the whole world and destroy the United States. We can live with you as different but separate regimes. And this leads to the first thaw in the Cold War. Eisenhower's open, he's receptive to some of this. It goes along with his long-term New Look policy, which says we don't have to go after the Russians right now in every way, shape, or form. A lot of more cold ice gets thrown onto this thawing in the Cold War, though, with the 1956 Hungarian Crisis. Hungary, which is behind the Iron Curtain, was trying to throw off or limit some Soviet influence. The Russians ultimately can't stand this. They move in with tanks, crush this uprising, and the United States does nothing. Because in a very realistic sense, despite all the talk of perhaps rollback or liberating this region, we're not in a position to do it. The Soviets are connected to it. They're right there. They have troops on the ground. And so the United States is largely sort of saying, like Latin America for us, That's sort of your sphere, and we don't like it, but we can't do anything about it. This, however, does kind of bring a screeching halt to the initial thaw that was happening in the Cold War. Couple this also with Sputnik heading into outer space, and the Russians seen as a satellite. The Russians seem to have gotten this big leap forward on technology, which is going to spur the United States to spend more money on educational research. In fact, the Advanced Placement Program is a direct outcome of federal monies being spent to try to literally get the United States better rocket scientists, starting with our young kids in our most advanced schools with our strongest programs. And NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, is established to essentially begin the space race to compete with the Soviets for control of outer space so as to not allow them to dominate in terms of intercontinental ballistic missiles and be able to project their nuclear power onto us with us being defenseless to do anything against it. Because Russia was such a closed environment, Dwight Eisenhower authorized spy plane flights over the Soviet Union. And these spy plane flights that were authorized they were camera filming, they were filming Soviet defense installations, etc. This is going to permanently sort of stop any Cold War progress that the Soviets and Americans can make towards reconciliation, because one of these U-2 planes gets shot down over Russia, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, and the pilot's captured alive. And so the Soviets claim, the Americans have been spying on us, and Eisenhower denies it, and then all of a sudden Khrushchev trots out Francis Gary Powers and the wreckage of the plane and says, well, how about them apples? Eisenhower admits that, yes, we did it, and he takes responsibility himself. He says, I authorized the flights. And so he takes the blame and says, we're probably going to have to keep doing something along these lines, but just because we live under open skies and the Russians don't, and we don't apologize for what we did, even though we might not really be able to do it again, but they're exposed after Eisenhower's kind of been called out in his lie. This will end any chance of Cold War progress, coupled along with the Second Berlin Showdown. The Russians were going to give the Americans, once again, they wanted to reclaim Berlin for East Germany. We're going to give them 6 months to pull their troops out. The Allies say, well, we're not going to go anywhere, and both sides agree to kind of put that on the shelf. They're not going to talk about it anymore. This will ultimately culminate itself just after Eisenhower's departure in the Berlin Wall being built and West Berlin being walled off from all the rest of East Germany, East Berlin, which is probably the most enduring symbol there was of the Cold War. As he leaves office, Eisenhower warns about the consequences of things like all the policies that he's been kind of involved in, things like brinkmanship, massive retaliation, and also some earlier policies, such as National Security Memo 68, which said things like the United States needed to have massive military facilities, massive defense buildups, and be prepared for permanent war, have large standing armies and military forces at all times. Eisenhower says this can kind of maybe not just unbalance the economy, but unbalance our sense of freedoms and liberties, as we're now going to be driven, perhaps in some ways, by this tight nexus of government and political individuals being tied with large, major corporate conglomerates that are playing a major role with a big footprint in the economy as well, coming together in this marriage which is more and more and more maybe going to drive some of our economy as opposed to simply having the free market drive our economy. Eisenhower said there could be consequences of this. He gives this as his farewell address, even though the entire time being in, he's been an active role in the process because obviously, survival as they saw it of the free democracies of the West was at stake. But it didn't mean it didn't come without sort of a price tag, not just an equinomic one, but as he saw it, sort of an institutional governmental one. And we'll see this military-industrial complex play some other greater roles in the quicksands of Vietnam and some of the areas beyond, as Americans by the 60s will begin to really question what their government is doing, what their foreign policy is, and what their social and economic policies ought to be.